Do we really need multiple availability zones in AWS? What will happen if I will create my infra in a single availability zone? Or how my cost will get impacted if I will create my infra across different availability zones? As a DevOps engineer, these questions always comes in your mind. Let's try to find the answers of these. So first of all, let's try to understand what availability zone is. So from the AWS documentation, you can see across different continents, AWS has different regions where they are providing their services. So if you see this, all the dots in the green have functional regions, and the ones which are there in red shows like the region are coming soon. So let's say North America, if you see here, Ohio has 3 availability zones. Similarly, North Virginia has 6 availability zones. In, let's say, Asia Pacific, India, in Mumbai, we have 3 availability zones. So across different regions also, AWS has different availability zones. So in simple words, an availability zone is a group of or a cluster of data centers where AWS infra is typically hosted. And inside a particular region, there can be 3 to 6 availability zones present. So the question is, should we create our infra across all the availability zones which are present? So let's say in Mumbai there are 3, but we saw in North Virginia there were 6 availability zones. So is it required to create infra across all those 6 availability zones? So just stay with me, we'll try to find the answers for each one of them. So let's understand it more better with this diagram. So this outer periphery is a particular region, right? Now inside any particular region, you will create a VPC in AWS, and this VPC can consist of one or more availability zones. So you have an option while creating your VPC, and you can select how many number of availability zones you wanted to use while creating a VPC. And inside your availability zones, you will have your subnets, and then inside your subnets, you will have your workloads running. So the main purpose of these availability zone is like, let's say there is some situation of disaster, right? So something happened, and let's say there is a power failure or there is a network failure in a particular availability zone. So what you can do is you can switch your traffic to the second availability zones, and your actual customer is not impacted, right? So your traffic will start serving from this availability zone, and till the time they are fixing the issue here, your actual customer will not impacted. This was the original purpose of having different availability zones in AWS. Let's see what is the AWS recommended way of using multiple availability zones. So let's take an example of 3 availability zones. So let's say this is the user, and user wants to send traffic to your infra which is hosted on AWS. So at the top level, you will have a layer of load balancer, right? And a load balancer will send traffic to your actual application server, and this application server can interact with a database, right? So this load balancer is already a managed service provided by AWS. So you just have to select your subnets while creating this load balancer, and this will automatically get distributed across different availability zones. You don't have to do anything manually. Now while creating your actual workloads, your application servers, you will have to keep in mind, like, you will have at least one server in a particular availability zone. So let's say if this availability zone is having some issue, so your traffic is not getting impacted, your traffic will get served from the 2 other availability zones. Similarly, if let's say availability zone 2 has some problem, your traffic will get served from either availability zone 3 or availability zone 1. Similarly, you should also distribute your database so that it is present in all the availability zones, right? So there are different strategies by which you can manually create this database across different availability zones, or there are some managed services also available by AWS like RDS, Aurora, which provides your RDS or your database to be spread across different availability zones. So this is the recommendation which AWS tells us how to create our infra, so that if there is any problem in a particular availability zone, my uptime will not get impacted. Now let's see what are the challenges in this. This looks good to me, right? So let's understand what are the challenges in having this. The main problem is data transfer cost. So creating availability zone doesn't incur you any cost, right? You just have to create a subnet there and it will not cost you anything. But the moment you will start transferring data from one availability zone to another, there is a data transfer cost associated. Let's understand it better with the diagram. So let's say this is your availability zone 1, this is your availability zone 2. We have one EC2 here, one here, and similarly this is my MySQL replica and this is my MySQL primary, right? So let's say if I'm doing data transfer between my EC2 to my MySQL primary, or let's say if I'm reading data from my EC2 box to my primary MySQL, right, there will be no data transfer cost because this data transfer is happening within a single availability zone, so there is no data transfer cost associated. But let's say if this EC2 box tries to query something from the database, let's say this EC2 box tries to query something from the primary database, so this is in a different availability zone and this RDS primary is altogether in a different availability zone. So hence you will have to pay for the data transfer. So the amount of data which is getting transferred over the network between two availability zones, you will have to pay for that. Similarly, if this EC2 box is trying to communicate with some other EC2 box which is deployed on some other availability zone, you will have to pay for the data transfer there as well. Data transfer between the managed services is not charged. So similarly, let's say this MySQL replica is there, right? And it will keep on trying to replicate the data from the primary. So data transfer between these two will not get charged, right? So data transfer between the managed services is free, but data transfer from EC2 to some managed service is chargeable. So this is the main problem while handling different availability zones. Let's see what next. Yeah, so the next problem is having multiple NAT gateways. So we have talked about the intercommunication. So let's say my EC2 box was communicating to the database, or let's say my EC2 was communicating to some other EC2. But in this case, my EC2 wants to communicate to the public internet. Let's say I have some public APIs, or I'm grabbing some data from Google, or anything can be the use case. So for that, you need to have a NAT gateway in place so that your traffic can go out. Now, NAT gateway is a service which is specific to a availability zone, right? You cannot have a NAT gateway which is deployed across availability zones like the load balancers and all. So let's say if you are having multiple availability zones, you are having only two options. One is like the way it is shown in this diagram, have a separate NAT gateway in all the availability zones, right? The second option is have a NAT gateway in any one of the availability zone and allow the traffic from other availability zones as well, so that they can use the common NAT gateway. Now let's see what are the problems in both the approaches. So let's say if you are having different NAT gateway in all availability zones, so what will happen? The data transfer between your EC2 and NAT gateway will not be charged. You will only have to pay for the NAT gateway. There is one fixed cost, and the traffic which is going outside, you will only have to pay for that. Similarly, if you are having 3 NAT gateways, so there will be some fixed cost associated with every NAT gateway that you will have to pay. For the data transfer, only the traffic which is going outside, or you will have to pay for that only. But in case of single NAT gateway, so let's say you have created a NAT gateway in availability zone A only, and you have updated your route table in such a way so that if EC2 instance in this availability zone or in this availability zone tries to send some data outside, they will use this NAT gateway only. So in that case, what will happen? You can save the cost of these two additional NAT gateways, right? So you won't have to pay for the fixed cost of these two NAT gateways. But the moment you will try to send some data from these two EC2 instances using this NAT gateway, there will be a data transfer cost for the data transfer between availability zone B and availability zone A. So what you will have to pay, the data transfer cost between these two availability zones and the data transfer cost going to internet. So any of this is something you will have to pay in any case, but this is the additional cost, the data transfer cost between these two availability zones, right? So this is one more problem when you are dealing with multiple availability zones, right? Let's see what next. This is very common, right? So right now most of the organizations have some compliance in place. Let's talk about fintech, healthcare, or anything. They always have a requirement, compliance requirement of having a DR setup in place. DR setup is your disaster recovery setup. What will happen in case of any natural disaster? So some people say like you can use your AWS availability zones in order to set up your DR. So that is not completely true. So AWS availability zones can help you to cope up with the internal downtimes of AWS. So let's say internally AWS data centers are having some problem. So with different availability zones, you can avoid that, right? But it will not meet your compliance requirements. So the compliance basically says like you should have your disaster recovery setup in some place which is completely isolated from the previous one, right? In terms of all electricity, network, building, seismic zone, everything, right? And AWS availability zones are typically not separated by a huge distance. So the maximum distance is 100 kilometers, which is on theory, but usually they are 5 to 10 kilometers apart, right? And compliance is like they should have been situated in a different seismic zone altogether. So deploying my resources in different availability zones will not solve my DR problem, right? Anyhow, after enabling different availability zones, I will have to set up my DR in some other data center anyhow. Now there is one more question, like how frequently these availability zones go down, right? So what is the SLA for these things? Let's understand that from the AWS documentation itself, what they are committing. So talking about the instance level SLA only, right? So what AWS says is like they are committing the SLA for a EC2 instance for about 99.5%, right? So yeah, your EC2 boxes will go down. You should definitely not rely on a single EC2 box for any particular thing, right? At least have your things distributed across different EC2 boxes, because in my real-time experience also I have seen EC2 boxes going down due to AWS failures, right? So it's a hardware thing, right? It can fail, right? So definitely you should avoid a single point of failures. But will this problem will get solved by distributing my resources across different availability zones? So answer is like no. You can solve this by using different EC2 instances in the same availability zone as well, right? So what will happen, right? If I will start replicating resources across different availability zones, or maybe I start replicating my resources in the same availability zone, what does it typically means, right? Let's understand that. Yeah, so we were having this diagram earlier, right? So in this diagram it typically says like you should replicate your resources across different availability zones, right? So let's say if I have a particular application, so AWS typically says like you should deploy the same application in availability zone 1, in availability zone 2, and in availability zone 3. So if the request goes to any of the EC2 box, right, they will all give me the same kind of response. This is one way. But can I replicate my EC2 instances in the same availability zone itself? So yeah, answer is yes, because EC2 boxes can go down. So definitely having a single availability zone with single EC2 instance is not the solution. So you should definitely replicate your EC2 instances, and definitely you can do that in same availability zone as well. Now what will be the problem? So the only problem will be like if the complete availability zone is having some problem, in that case only you will get impacted. In case of these EC2 failures, you will be untouched, right? And talking about the managed services, right? So these managed services are deployed in an auto scaling way, right? So having problem in a particular availability zone will not impact these managed services, right? Because they are deployed in a self-healing way. So it will not impact your managed services. So you only have to take care of the things which you are managing, and it typically comes up with the EC2 boxes, right? So what will be a smart way of using multiple availability zones, right? So with this, I will just conclude it. So I have seen a lot of guys who say like we have multiple availability zones in AWS, and uh, definitely we should enable all the availability zones to create our infra. Without this, your application will not be in high availability mode and this and that. So the simple question is, I know we all have created different availability zones, right? But are we distributing our resources also in across different availability zones? So let's say if you are trying to deploy a particular application, right? So guys usually deploy the application in at least 2 to 3 EC2 boxes, all right? Or let's say they will create at least 2 to 3 instances of their application. But so are they all spread across different availability zones? So let's say in case of EC2, it is fine. You can create 3 static EC2 boxes like this, and you can deploy your application separately on all of them. But let's say if I'm using Kubernetes, right? Am I taking care of that thing so that whenever I'm increasing my replica sets, am I making sure like my replica sets should get spread across different availability zones? So if you're not using that, then there is no point of having different availability zones, right? Similarly, in case of database, so in most of the cases, we do create a RDS which is in a single availability zone itself, right? So if you are having different availability zones and your RDS is deployed in a single availability zone, then again there is no sense, right, of having different availability zones in place. Because if your infra is not deployed in a proper way, then it doesn't make sense, right? So according to me, this there might be different opinions on that, but according to me, yeah, definitely we should create 3 availability zones. But in order to deploy our applications, I think there is if it compare the cost versus the uptime, definitely the cost is way high, right? So we should always treat any one of the availability zone as our primary, and we'll try to deploy everything there only, right? So that your data transfer cost is zero, right? Because you will deploy everything here, so your EC2 box will be here, your RDS will be here, your other EC2 box will be also in the same availability zone. So all the intercommunication between your infrastructure will not have any cost associated. And literally I have seen availability zone data transfer cost in thousands of dollars, right? So definitely this is very high if you have a good infra in place. So having things in a single availability zone doesn't impact you unless you are replicating your resources and you're not having anything as a single point of failure. Now, am I saying like don't use other 2 availability zones? So answer is no. So always have your other 2 availability zones as a backup in place, right? So there right now infra as a code kind of things in place. We have Kubernetes right now, which is giving us the flexibility to create infra in runtime, like just a blink of an eye, right? So using those automations in place, you should design your infra in such a way so that if there is any problem in this availability zone, your infra get replicated in other availability zones which are available. So treat this as your primary availability zone for deploying everything. And in case of any failures detected by a monitoring system, immediately start replicating the things in other two availability zones. And once the things are normal, delete these resources and come back to availability zone 1 itself, right? So you can achieve this thing in Kubernetes very easily, right? There are different node groups you can create. So let's say you can create one node group for one availability zone. You can create other node groups for these availability zones, and you can set priority, right? So there are priority expanders available which you can use, and that will make things very easy, right? So you can set the priority of this as very high, and these two as a low priority. So always it will try to replicate the nodes here itself, but in case of any problem, it will immediately start creating the resources in the secondary availability zones. Yeah, so this is it for now. Do share your thoughts as well on this in the comments, and let's keep this discussion healthy. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.